When I walked into the living room that evening, I wasn't expecting anything out of the ordinary. Mom was running late, as usual, and I was left alone with her husband, Jordan, the man who had seamlessly stepped into our lives 3 years ago and somehow made himself indispensable. Charming, confident, and far too comfortable in our home. He was sitting on the couch, scrolling through his phone, looking as if he owned the world. "Hey, Alice," he said, flashing that easy smile that always felt just a little too knowing. "Mind giving me a hand?" His tone was casual, but something in his eyes wasn't. "With what?" I asked, trying to sound indifferent. "My shoulders are killing me." "Too many hours at the gym this week," he said, patting the space on the couch next to him. My heart skipped a beat. I knew I should have said no, but instead, I hesitated. It was a harmless request, right? Except nothing about this felt harmless. I sat down, keeping a deliberate gap between us. "Just tell me where it hurts," I mumbled, avoiding his gaze. The moment my hands touched his shoulders, I regretted it. His skin was warm, his muscles tense under my fingers. The air between us seemed to thicken, and I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't just about a massage. "You're good at this," he said softly, his voice lower now. "Really good." I tried to laugh it off. Not exactly my career plan. But then he leaned back slightly, just enough for our eyes to meet. Maybe it should be. "You've got the touch, Alice." There it was again, that look. The one that lingered too long, crossed an invisible line. My breath caught in my throat, and I pulled my hands back, standing up abruptly. "I think you're good now," I said, forcing a laugh that didn't sound convincing. Jordan just smiled, leaning back on the couch like he hadn't just sent my mind spiraling. "Thanks, kiddo. You're a lifesaver." I rushed to my room, slamming the door behind me, my heart racing. What was that? Why did it feel like he was testing me, pushing boundaries I didn't even know existed? And the worst part? It wasn't just him. There was something in me, a tiny, treacherous part of me, that hadn't hated it. I stared at my reflection in the mirror, my face flushed, my hands trembling. "Get a grip," I whispered to myself. "This isn't happening." But deep down, I knew it was. And this? This was just the beginning. I avoided Jordan after that night, doing everything I could to stay out of his way. If he was in the living room, I'd retreat to my room. If he came into the kitchen, I'd find an excuse to leave. But no matter how much distance I put between us, I couldn't escape him. His presence lingered in the air, heavy and inescapable, like a shadow I couldn't outrun. It wasn't just physical, either. It was his voice, his laugh, the way his eyes seemed to follow me even when I wasn't looking. I'd catch glimpses of him out of the corner of my eye, standing at the window, sitting on the edge of the couch, leaning against the doorway, and every time, it felt deliberate, like he wanted me to know he was there. I tried to convince myself I was imagining it, that I was reading too much into things. But then there were the moments I couldn't explain away. The way his hand would brush against mine when he handed me a glass of water. The way he'd linger in a room just a little too long after everyone else had left. The way his voice would soften when he said my name, like it was meant for me alone. This is wrong, I told myself over and over, clinging to the thought like a lifeline. But the more I repeated it, the less certain I felt. Because somewhere deep down, beneath all the guilt and confusion, there was something else. Something darker. Something that wanted him to look at me that way. One evening, I was sitting at the dining table, pretending to study, when Jordan walked in. It was just the two of us. Mom was working late again. I kept my eyes on the page in front of me, hoping he'd pass by without a word. But he didn't. Instead, he stopped beside me, leaning against the table. "You seem tense lately," he said, his voice casual, but his tone too knowing. "I'm fine," I said quickly, not looking up. He didn't move. "Are you sure? You don't seem fine." "I'm just stressed about exams," I lied, my voice shaky. I could feel his eyes on me, searching for something. Jordan stepped closer, his shadow falling over me. "Alice," he said softly, "you don't have to carry everything by yourself. You can talk to me, you know." I finally looked up, and the intensity in his gaze made my breath catch. "I'm okay," I said, but the words felt hollow. He reached out, his hand brushing against my shoulder. You need to trust people who care about you, he said, his touch lingering just a moment too long. I pulled away, standing up so quickly my chair scraped against the floor. I have to finish this, I stammered, grabbing my books and heading for my room without looking back. But even as I shut the door behind me, his words echoed in my mind. Trust people who care about you. Was that what this was? Care? Or was it something else entirely? That night, I lay awake for hours, staring at the ceiling and replaying every moment in my head. The way his voice softened when he spoke to me. The way his hand lingered on my shoulder. The way my own heart raced every time he was near. I hated it. I hated him. But most of all, I hated myself. Because no matter how hard I tried to fight it, I couldn't deny the truth. A part of me wanted him to touch me again. The next day, I told myself things would be different. I'd put an end to this once and for all. But when I walked into the kitchen and found him standing there, leaning casually against the counter, all my resolve melted away. Morning, he said, his smile warm and easy, like nothing had happened. I mumbled a reply, keeping my eyes down as I poured myself a cup of coffee. Still stressed, he asked, his voice laced with something I couldn't quite place. I'm fine, I said, forcing myself to sound indifferent. But then he stepped closer, so close I could feel the heat of his body. You don't have to pretend with me, Alice, he said, his voice low. I can see right through you. I turned to him, my heart pounding. What do you want from me? I demanded, my voice trembling. He smiled, but it wasn't the easy, carefree smile I was used to. This one was darker, more deliberate. I think you already know, he said. For a moment, neither of us moved. The air between us was thick with unspoken words, unacknowledged desires. And then, just as quickly as it had started, he stepped back, his expression shifting to something almost casual. Have a good day, kiddo, he said, turning and walking out of the kitchen like nothing had happened. But as I stood there, clutching my coffee cup with trembling hands, I knew better. Something had shifted between us, something I couldn't take back. And the worst part? I wasn't sure I wanted to. Jordan started staying home more often when Mom was working late. It was subtle at first, an extra evening here, a weekend there, but it wasn't long before his presence felt inescapable. I couldn't avoid him anymore. And the worst part? I wasn't sure I wanted to. There was something about the way he moved through the house, so confident, so comfortable. It wasn't just his physical presence, it was the way he filled the space, like every room belonged to him. And when I was in that space, it was like he saw only me. I tried to keep my distance, to convince myself that nothing had changed, but every glance, every word, every seemingly innocent touch told me otherwise. I told myself I hated him for it, for making me feel this way, for crossing lines that should never have been crossed. But deep down, I knew the truth. I hated myself more. One evening, I was lying on my bed with my headphones on, trying to drown out my thoughts with music. The door was half open, and I didn't hear him come in until he was standing right there. Knock, knock, he said, leaning against the door frame with that infuriatingly calm smile. I sat up quickly, pulling off my headphones. What are you doing in here? Relax, he said, holding up his hands like he was harmless. I just wanted to check on you. I'm fine, I said, my voice sharper than I intended. He didn't leave. Instead, he stepped inside, closing the door halfway behind him. You've been so quiet lately, he said, his tone softer now. I just wanted to make sure you're okay. I'm fine, I repeated, though the tremor in my voice betrayed me. Jordan crossed the room slowly, sitting down on the edge of my bed. Too close. You don't seem fine, he said, his eyes locking onto mine. I froze, every muscle in my body screaming at me to move, to say something, to do anything to stop this. But I couldn't. I was caught, like a moth in a web, unable to escape even though I knew the danger. We need to stop this, I said finally, my voice barely above a whisper, before he goes too far. Jordan didn't move. He just looked at me, his expression unreadable. Stop what, Alice? He asked, his voice so calm, so steady it made my head spin. You know what, I said, my words trembling under the weight of everything unsaid between us. For a moment, he didn't respond. Then he leaned forward, his gaze never leaving mine. "Tell me to leave," he said quietly. "If that's what you really want, just say the word, and I'll walk out that door right now." I opened my mouth to speak, but no sound came out. My mind was screaming at me to tell him to go, to push him away, to end this once and for all. But my body betrayed me, every nerve drawn to him like a magnet. "I can't," I whispered, the words barely audible. Jordan's hand reached out, brushing a strand of hair from my face. His touch was electric, sending shivers down my spine. "Then maybe you don't want me to," he said, his voice low and dangerous. I should have run. I should have screamed. But instead, I stayed frozen, caught in the pull of something I didn't understand. He leaned closer, his breath warm against my skin. "You don't have to be afraid, Alice," he said softly. "I'd never hurt you." But that wasn't what scared me. What scared me was the way my heart raced when he was near, the way my body seemed to move toward him without my consent. What scared me was how much I wanted this, even when I knew I shouldn't. The sound of the front door slamming shut broke the moment like a shard of glass. Mom was home. Jordan stood up quickly, his composure unshaken. "We'll finish this conversation later," he said, his voice calm as ever. And then he was gone, leaving me alone with the chaos he'd left behind. I sat there for a long time, my mind racing. What had just happened? What was I doing? But even as the guilt and shame washed over me, I knew one thing for certain. This wasn't over. Not even close. My dreams had become a tangled reflection of the chaos inside me. Every night, I found myself standing on the edge of something dark and uncharted, a place where my conscience and my desires waged a silent war. I'd wake up drenched in sweat, the lines between right and wrong blurred beyond recognition. The days weren't much better. Jordan was everywhere. His voice, his scent, his presence, all of it clung to me, a constant reminder of the fire I was too afraid to extinguish, but too entranced to walk away from. When Mom announced she'd be going on another work trip, my heart sank and raced at the same time. A whole weekend alone with Jordan. The thought filled me with equal parts dread and anticipation. The first night, I locked myself in my room, determined to keep my distance. But by the second evening, my resolve began to waver. I was tired of fighting a battle I wasn't sure I wanted to win. It was his idea, of course. "Let's watch a movie," he suggested casually as I passed through the living room. His tone was so innocent, so matter-of-fact, that I almost believed it. "It's just a movie," I told myself as I sat down on the far end of the couch, clutching a pillow like a shield. The screen flickered to life, but I barely registered the opening credits. My focus was on the space between us, a gulf that seemed to shrink with every passing second. Jordan didn't push. He didn't have to. It was the little things, the way his arms stretched along the back of the couch, brushing against my shoulder, the way his legs shifted, inching closer to mine. Every touch, no matter how small, sent a current through me, igniting something I didn't want to name. Halfway through the movie, his hand moved, resting lightly on my knee. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. "You're tense," he said, his voice soft, almost soothing. I wanted to shove his hand away, to stand up and walk out of the room. But I didn't. Instead, I stayed rooted to the spot, my heart pounding as his fingers traced small, lazy circles on my skin. "This isn't right," I whispered, my voice trembling. Jordan turned to me, his expression unreadable. "What's right and wrong isn't always so clear, Alice," he said, leaning in closer. "Sometimes you just have to follow your heart." "My heart is telling me to run," I said, but even as I spoke the words, I knew they weren't true. "Is it?" he asked, his voice low and steady. "Because it doesn't look like you're running." I looked away, staring at the flickering screen as if it could offer me an escape. But there was no escape, not from him, and not from myself. He leaned closer, his breath warm against my ear. "You don't have to be afraid," he murmured. "I'm not going to hurt you." But I was afraid. Not of him, but of what I was becoming. Of the way my body betrayed me, leaning into his touch when every rational part of me screamed to pull away. "I can't do this," I said, standing up abruptly. His hand fell away, and I took a shaky step back, clutching the pillow to my chest like it could protect me. Jordan didn't follow. He stayed where he was, his gaze calm but unwavering. "You don't have to decide anything tonight," he said. "But don't pretend you don't feel it too." I fled to my room, slamming the door behind me and locking it for good measure. My heart was racing, my mind a whirlwind of emotions I couldn't sort through. But even as I sat there in the darkness, trying to steady my breathing, his words lingered. "Don't pretend you don't feel it too." He was right. I couldn't pretend anymore. The next day, I tried to avoid him again, but it was futile. He was everywhere, leaning against the kitchen counter when I went for coffee, sitting in the living room with a book when I passed through. It felt like a game of cat and mouse, only I wasn't sure who was the hunter and who was the prey. By evening, I was a bundle of nerves. I paced my room, debating whether to confront him or stay hidden. But then there was a knock at my door. "Come in," I said before I could think better of it. Jordan stepped inside, closing the door behind him. "We need to talk," he said, his voice calm but firm. "There's nothing to talk about," I said quickly. He shook his head. "You don't believe that any more than I do." I backed away as he approached, the small room feeling even smaller with every step he took. "Jordan, please," I said, my voice barely audible. He stopped a few feet away, his expression softer now. "I'm not trying to scare you, Alice," he said. "I just want you to be honest with me and with yourself." I looked away, unable to meet his gaze. "I can't," I whispered. "Yes, you can," he said, taking another step closer. "Just tell me the truth. What do you want?" I opened my mouth to speak, but no words came out. I didn't know what I wanted. Or maybe I did, and I was just too afraid to admit it. Jordan reached out, his hand brushing against mine. "It's okay," he said softly. "You don't have to say anything. Just don't run away." And I didn't. It happened so fast, I barely had time to process how far things had spiraled. The air between us felt electric, charged with unspoken tension. His touch was no longer hesitant. His fingertips grazed my arm, sending a shiver down my spine. The room seemed smaller, the walls closing in, and all I could hear was the thunder of my heartbeat. "Alice," Jordan said, his voice barely above a whisper. It wasn't just the tone, it was the weight behind it. He made me feel like I was the only person who mattered, the only one who could understand him. But deep down, I knew this was wrong. "We can't do this," I said, though my words lacked conviction. My mind was screaming at me to walk away, but my body betrayed me, rooted in place. "It's not about what's right or wrong," he replied, stepping closer. "It's about what feels real." I opened my mouth to argue, to say something, anything, but the words died on my lips when his hand cupped my cheek. I felt trapped, not by force, but by my own inability to resist. The line we shouldn't cross was right there, and I could feel it crumbling beneath us. The sound of the front door opening snapped me back to reality like a splash of cold water. I pushed him away, my breath hitching as panic set in. "Mom," I whispered, my voice trembling. My heart sank as I turned to see her standing there, suitcase in hand, her expression a mixture of shock and anger. Her gaze darted between Jordan and me, her eyes narrowing as the pieces began to fall into place. The silence was deafening, the weight of her presence suffocating. "What the hell is going on here?" she demanded, her voice sharp enough to cut through the tension. "Mom, it's not what it looks like," I stammered, but even as I said it, I knew how hollow it sounded. She dropped her suitcase with a thud, her hands shaking. "Not what it looks like. Alice, do you think I'm blind?" "Margaret," Jordan began, his tone calm but cautious. "Let's not jump to conclusions." Her laugh was bitter and cold. "Conclusions? Oh, I think the conclusion is pretty damn obvious. You've been manipulating her, haven't you?" "No, it's not like that," I tried to interject, but she wasn't listening. "And you," she said, turning her fury on me. How could you let this happen?" Her words hit me like a slap to the face. Tears welled up in my eyes as I struggled to find an explanation that didn't sound like an excuse. Jordan took a step forward, his expression unreadable. "Margaret, please, let's talk about this rationally." "Rationally?" she repeated, her voice rising. You want to talk about rationality while you're... She cut herself off, shaking her head as if trying to dispel the thought. I can't even look at you right now. Mom, please, let me explain, I begged, but she silenced me with a glare. Explain what, Alice? That you've been sneaking around with my husband. Her voice broke on the last word, and I could see the betrayal etched on her face. Jordan's expression darkened. Margaret, you're being unfair. This isn't just on her. You're damn right it's not just on her, she snapped. But she's my daughter. You were supposed to protect her, not. She trailed off, unable to finish the sentence. The tension in the room was unbearable. I felt like I was suffocating, caught between the two people who were supposed to care about me the most. But as I looked at Jordan, something shifted. His calm demeanor, his calculated words, it all felt off. You planned this, didn't you? I said, my voice barely above a whisper. He turned to me, his expression unreadable. Alice, don't. Don't what? I pressed, my anger rising. Don't call you out for manipulating me? For using me? That's not what happened, he said, but there was a flicker of something in his eyes, guilt, maybe? Or fear, isn't it? I shot back. You knew exactly what you were doing. Every word, every touch, it was all part of your game, wasn't it? Alice, stop, he said, his voice low and warning. But I couldn't stop. The floodgates had opened, and everything I'd been holding back came pouring out. You made me think you cared about me, I said, my voice cracking. But you don't care about anyone but yourself. Mom's voice cut through the chaos. Both of you, stop it. Just stop. We both fell silent, the weight of her words settling over us. She took a deep breath, her hands trembling as she ran them through her hair. I can't deal with this right now, she said, her voice barely audible. Jordan, get out. I don't care where you go, but you're not staying here. He hesitated, glancing at me as if waiting for me to defend him. But I didn't. I couldn't. Now, she yelled, and he flinched before turning and walking out the door without another word. The silence that followed was deafening. Mom turned to me, her eyes filled with a mix of anger and heartbreak. I trusted you, Alice, she said, her voice trembling. I trusted you to know better. How could you let this happen? Tears streamed down my face as I tried to find the words, but there was nothing I could say to make it better. She shook her head, her expression hardening. I don't even know who you are anymore. Her words cut deeper than anything else, and I felt a wave of shame so overwhelming I thought I might collapse under it. As she turned and walked away, leaving me alone in the empty living room, I felt a hollow ache in my chest. This was supposed to be the end, but it didn't feel like it. The damage was done, but the scars were just beginning to form. If you were in my shoes, what would you have done? Who's really to blame here, me, him, or both of us? Let me know in the comments.